deeply. We've been talking about Charlottesville and the events leading up to it and the events afterwards. We had on yesterday Brian Moran, Secretary of Public Safety, walked us through it. We had Dave Mills, former executive director of the Democratic Party of Virginia. We had on Rip Sullivan, who is chairing the House Democratic Caucus campaign. So this has been a very bipartisan discussion. We've taken your calls. The lines are open, 888-480-5646, 888-480-5646, or you can text me, 540-294-0680, 540-294-0680. This segment is brought to you by Cornerstone First Financial. Call Cornerstone First Financial, 866-62-1221, cornerstonefirst.com. Interest rates have fallen to pre-election levels. These are the lowest rates of the year, and if you missed your opportunity to lock in the last fall, now is the time. Janet Yellen and the Fed is meeting again soon, and in all likelihood, they will continue to vote to raise rates. Call Mark Livingstone, 866-625-1221, 866-625-1221, or visit cornerstonefirst.com, cornerstonefirst.com. Joining us here in a second is going to be Shaun, Kenney, good friend of mine for a number of years, who was former executive director of the Republican Party of Virginia. So he was, I think at the same time, David Mills was at the Democratic Party of Virginia. Both are friends. I've worked with both, continue to do so, talk to them on a weekly basis, and I'm richly blessed by that time. But we talk about, more than anything else, how to get things done. Campaigns are about what we want. And as David Brooks wrote in 2016, as I've said the last couple of days, the downside, as you wrote in 2016 in February, the governing cancer of our time, the downside of politics is that people never really get everything that they want. How true in life is that? Politics is the mirror of life. And our culture is, politics is downstream of our culture. And when we start accepting the fact that we're not getting everything we want in life, we'll be more accepting of that in politics and just take our incremental successes and improvements as we go along as big improvements. The incremental approach that we take in Virginia is very important. It's driven by our single object rule. That means whatever we're going to pass, like it's this coffee cup, I'm going to deal with coffee. You can't come in and say, okay, now we're going to deal with bananas. No, you have to stick to the subject, and that's called single object, the one thing we're going to talk about. D.C. does not operate that way, and I believe it should. Because when the bills come back from the Senate and they have other things thrown on there, the House can say that's not germane to the bill. So that's one of the reasons why Virginia gets a lot of things done, because we take little bites at the apple and move things along. We can disagree, but as Rip Sullivan said yesterday, of the 2,000 bills that are passed, most are small, tiny changes that matter, but those are negotiated over time, and everyone has to compromise. We still have about 20 or so bills that are lightning rod issues. But for the vast majority of issues, the men and women in the legislature get along very well, and they govern in a bipartisan way and we have a single-term governor, which I support. I think it's healthy. I think it keeps the ball moving along, that we don't have a governor running for re-election so that he can focus on governing and handing the baton off to the next governor. And our election is this November. Please pay attention. There's a lot going on. Joining us now, after that very long introduction and segue, Shaun Kenney. Shaun, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here, boss. How are you doing?
Up and at 'em.
Yeah, seriously. Good to be on the show.
That's the coffee talking, right?
There we go.
So you're a very thoughtful man. You post a lot on social media. You drive a lot of the conversation. You engage a lot of the conversation. Sometimes it's quite ugly. What are your thoughts a couple days out of what happened in Charlottesville?
I think initially some of the thoughts in Charlottesville, being in the area and whatnot, were just frankly just shock. I don't think anybody expected the sort of violence that was seen both sides. A number of commentators warned it. Obviously, a number of individuals told people stay away from Charlottesville. I think people still felt compelled to be out there for one reason or another. And unfortunately, it hurt people, and we have one person, one soul who's no longer walking the earth because of it. I think that sort of response, I think that the fallout, shocked a number of people in Charlottesville. It's not how the community wants to identify itself. I think the protests following it, I think there was something on the order of 660 of them nationwide. I think equally surprised a number of people. I mean, look, I mean, you've got two sides right now that are done talking. And when you have websites like the Daily Stormer out there saying that they measure their success by bodies in the hospital and bodies in the morgue, that's not exactly positive. When you've got communist flags and things of this nature being waved about, when you've got reporters getting beaten up in Richmond simply for doing their job, just for filming the Antifa protests, that's not a good place in America. I think that's something that every American really ought to kind of sit back in their chair and be slightly concerned about the way the conversation's going.
Yeah, and I think when people do that, they go, that's not who I am. That's not who anyone I know is. Right? Mm-hmm. I mean, it's such a small part of our society.
Yeah. I think, when you look at Charlottesville, I mean, think about it. You've got 120,000 people in Albemarle County. You've got 40,000 people in Charlottesville proper. We're really talking about 500 people on one side and, maybe like 2,000 people on the other. But this is a very tiny fraction of America. This is not your rank-and-file Democrat, your rank-and-file Republican. These are the fringes of the fringe going to war against one another. And so a little bit of perspective is warranted. The media is obviously going to play up the very worst for its own reasons. They have to sell ads. But a little bit of perspective is warranted. Nonetheless, I think it's pretty evident to most people that the political conversation has lending itself towards the extremes. And I think that's something that perhaps we need to have a bit more conversation about is, whether or not these extremes really deserve so much of our headspace rent-free, or whether or not we need to start having a different conversation, as you've advocated for many years, towards practical solutions, towards the center, towards what we can actually get done, rather than utopian schemes, so to speak.
Well, that's a lot of it is driven by that. It's such a small segment of our society, but how many of the worst parts of our human history have started with just a couple guys in a room going, "Hey, wouldn't it be great if we did this?" And people not going, "That's not a good idea. Put that down."
Right. Or people sitting back and saying, "You know what? It's only a handful of them. That's an extreme. They'll never aggregate numbers." I mean, bear in mind what happened in Charlottesville, both sides, and this is how these sort of extremist groups work: is that they get like 5 or 10, hardcore guys, and then they find 50, and then they put them in front of the opposition, and then you have Antifa throwing rocks, you have them throwing bottles full of urine, you have beating with sticks and whatnot, and then they beat back, and that's what gets them blooded. Same way as with Antifa. If you're a committed leftist and you want to be made a socialist, they put you in there and they give you a rock and say, "Here, throw this at the Nazis over there." And once you start doing that, then it starts sort of breaking down those barriers. I mean, these movements where they pretty much treat the opposition as something less than human, left or right, communists, Nazis, you name it. This is how they operate. This is how they blood people. It's a very seductive means of pulling people into an ideology. I mean, and unfortunately, that's our DNA. It's how we operate as human beings. It's how we operate as just human beings roaming about the savannah 10,000 years ago, right? The real antidote for that, obviously, is interaction, conversation, education, things of this nature. But that's hard in in an environment that we're sort of isolated in social media. It's very easy to spit back a quip than it is to understand the other individual, and that's a tough road. I mean, it's something that we as individuals and we as people who are a little bit more aware of that condition have to sort of kind of step up our game and kind of tamp down the crazy, so to speak.
Exactly, and one of the problems we get into though is that. You pointed out correctly. They brought urine bottles and balloons and rocks and that kind of stuff. But they also said, okay, would the other side bring this time? And then when it's broadcast around the world, and they're going, hey, Richmond's coming up in September. What we ought to do? We ought to do this, and that'll really get these guys fired up, and then we'll have a real escalation of the violence. If that's their goal, that's what's going to happen, right? Because in a lot of life, and we see this in sports especially, that's why sports is so instructive in our cultures, because these tiny adjustments that you see from the other side are really important. And my fear in this is, and my concern and my appeal to folks is, don't let the other side, these two groups, come together again in a larger scale environment. I mean, I was talking to John Adams in the last one. He brought up the Steve Scalise shooting in Alexandria. Can you imagine if that guy had shown up to Charlottesville?
Oh, yeah, it would have been an absolute mess. And John Adams, by the way, is a great human being. The more I hear him talk, the more I engage with him, the more I see him on the campaign trail, the more I really, really like that guy. He'll be if he wins, he'll be a great attorney general. But you're right. I mean, look, think about it for the 1920s, right? It used to be that the Ku Klux Klan would march down a Slavic neighborhood, an Italian neighborhood, a Catholic neighborhood, and they'd sit there and they'd rile folks up. And then the next day, the Knights of Columbus would get up, they'd put on their funny hats, they'd get their swords, they'd get their tuxedos and capes, and they'd march down the same neighborhood as a way to kind of reclaim it, right? But they never stood at the opposite end of it and threw rocks at them like you'd see in like gangs in New York, right?
Right.
I mean, they made sure to stay separate from them because they didn't want to become them, and they didn't want to give them what they were looking for, which was, which was a fight, pretty much. And so they waited till the next day and then took back their neighborhood. I think that there's something instructive in that, where we've handled radical groups like this before in our past, in the 1920s and the 1950s. Certainly in the 1960s and late 60s with the rise of leftist groups. There's a means of handling it. I think that we probably could learn something from our fathers and grandfathers in that regard, rather than following down the rabbit trail of merely sitting there and throwing rocks at the opposition like we saw in Charlottesville. Yeah,
it's a very important point you make there, and reflections on our history. But unfortunately, we have in our society this accelerant in conflict. In social media, not just media, but social media. You can get on the internet and say and do anything you want to, whether it's factual or not, and it's hard enough to pull back saying what actually happened in Charlottesville. And then when people, make up these claims and supports their own narrative, it can get really sideways very quickly. And unfortunately, we had Heather Heyer lost. She lost her life. She was run over by this guy from Charlottesville. You had 2 state troopers who were there patrolling and taking pictures and photographing and seeing things from above and coordinating that back with Command Central back there. And so they crashed. Burke Bates and Jake Cohen lost their lives. And this is real stuff. This is not just screaming in the wind anymore. I mean, we had a torch rally in Charlottesville, of all places, a torch rally. Then you had the next day, the actual assembly, the peaceable assembly that was supposed to have taken place, didn't take place because beforehand it got too out of control, and they said, unlawful, disperse, you're doing it wrong. And I think what we have to do going forward is not allow this to become the norm. And yesterday Brian Moran said he was afraid that this is the new norm, and I pushed back respectfully and said, no, not if we work together and not accept that. But we have to work. This is going to require work.
Sure. Well, I'll be honest. I lean towards Secretary Moran's sentiments. I am very much afraid that this becomes the new norm, because it really does take 2 to tango, right? I mean, if the Tiki Torch Parade, the Citronella Nazis, they want to go ahead and show up in Charlottesville around Lee Park, they're entitled to do so. That's their First Amendment right. I think the ACLU Virginia was absolutely right in making sure that they protected their ability to get out there and say stupid things, no matter how stupid they might be. But Antifa chose to engage them, right? If Antifa is not willing to do that, if they're not willing to take the adult step and scale it back, these guys are looking for a fight, right? They're getting ready to hold 9 more rallies across Virginia. I'm really hesitant to lump in the Virginia flaggers with the alt-right, by the way. I don't think that that's what they are. They've predated that. There are some folks in there that are odd. Mostly these guys are historians. We'll see what they've morphed into on the 16th, right? But the bottom line
hopefully,
here is that,
look, if they're historians, have a seminar. Really?
Yeah.
Rent a room at the Ramada and have a seminar, for crying out loud. Let's not have a rally around a statue with torches. I mean, it's just.
I think from like the 1970s, you will almost find every single weekend 1 or 2 of those guys or more standing outside the Museum of the Confederacy or something like that, or standing outside of the Virginia, right along the Museum District in Richmond, and they'll stand there with their flag. And they'll just offer information, trying to educate people on the nature of the Confederate flag. That's it. Right. That's all they do.
Right. I mean, it's right. Here's a pamphlet. Yeah,
Yeah, pretty much. There's street pictures, right? And that's good. I mean, this is America. They're entitled to do that. But again, the idea that every single idea that I disagree with has to be beaten out of the public square. That is a very dangerous mindset. That again, I mean, you see it on social media, you see it in Charlottesville, you see it at UC Berkeley, you see it on our college campuses, and you have individuals on the right that are adopting that mindset. That, I think, is what Mr. Moran's speaking towards. And I think that's a real concern, Chris. I got to be honest with you. I'm really concerned that that's the way conversation goes, unless folks like you and I and folks listening push back against that mentality.
And turn it into something far more constructive and say, look, if you want to talk about our nation's history, let's talk about our nation's history. It's fascinating. It's complex. Your own personal history is complex and fascinating. Let's put it in context. Let's draw the relevance from our past to today. You know, this is why I love history so much, and studying and saying, okay, yeah, this is what happened. Okay, well, this is what's going on today. So if we don't make those mistakes that we learned about, we won't make them today, right? That's called wisdom.
Right, and that's where, you know, in a culture that distills everything to 140 characters or less, it's really difficult to get to the idea that history is messy. It's not as clean cut as there were good guys and there were bad guys. Most of the time, there were two camps of bad guys. One just happened to win, and then they got to write their history book.
Exactly.
I mean, that's it. I mean, and so, you know, putting it to like Charlottesville, the alt-right, or Antifa, or whatever the case may be, you know, if both sides are pointing at the other and say that's bad speech, and we shouldn't have to tolerate bad speech or hate speech, and that's the absolute wrong mentality. And this, again, I think gets back to the ACLU Virginia's point overall, is that the antidote for bad speech is not quote unquote good speech; it's free speech, right? You know, the antidote for ideas that we disagree with is to constructively engage those ideas, whether it's history and realizing that history is a messy
have the debate.
thing.
Have the debate.
Yeah, have that debate. You know, have that seminar, right?
Right.
And have it in a polite, polite method that actually respects the other what the other individual's bringing to the table, rather than trying to get that one up. That,
exactly.
You know, the age of feelings seems to have replaced the age of reason with. You know,
scream louder. I didn't get it, but I didn't get it last time. I'm still not going to get it now, but I'm going to scream louder still. And
right,
right. We've seen that. Shaun, thanks for calling in. I think we got another caller coming in. Appreciate your phone call, and hopefully we'll catch up later in the week. Thanks for calling,
all right,
Shaun.
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, man. Take care.
Appreciate it.